I advise them that this is a sideshow. They're going private, whole discussion, and ultimately is that the fundamentals of the business are slowly coming together. I realize that this has two strong opinionated views on this, but I'm in the group that believes that the June results, September guidance, the demand for Model 3, and the bigger vision of the story will ultimately move this higher, whether it's a public or a private company. And so I think that's piece number one. Piece number two, like all of the Tesla story, it's going to be a wild ride here because it's not going to get sorted out in the next couple of weeks. I think this whole conversation is probably going to take 3 months, and ultimately we think it will end in the next year with Tesla going private.
Gene, before we get to Michael, I just want to ask one follow-up question, which is this. It makes no rational sense, at least in my mind, if your ambition was to take the company private, that you would go through all these machinations over the summer, building tents to build these cars, to try to nail the number. Frankly, if you plan to take the company private, and I don't mean to say this disingenuously, it's not clear to me you would try as hard to make these numbers because you wouldn't be focused on the short term. You'd be focused on the long term.
Well, by doing what they did over the summer, likely had a positive impact on the valuation. It didn't have it when they announced that 5,000 number.
But that's the point. Why do you, if you were taking the company private from a valuation perspective, you're not trying to buy it at the highest possible price. You're trying to buy it at the lowest possible price.
Yeah, well, ultimately,
to the buyer's interest.
I think one piece is that I think they would prefer a higher versus a lower valuation. I understand your point. But separately is that at the point where they were massively running to hit that 5,000 number, at that point they were working hard to still be a public company. And I think that some of the things that happened around that 5,000, the tent, the scrutiny around it, I think a lot of the negativity that maybe had an impact on some of the conversion from the pre-orders, I think all of this is kind of in motion. And I think over the last month and a half, things have changed. And I think that even though Musk has had an ambition of being private for a long time, I think that's become more acute in the last month and a half.
Okay, hang tight, Gene. I want to go to Michael for a second. Michael, if Gene is right, that this is going to take 2 to 3 months or longer to, quote unquote, go private, and it could be an even longer process than that, it ultimately suggests that what we heard in the tweet last week about this idea that funding is secured may not be the case, and I may be putting that politely.
Well, I think you're right, Andrew. That's exactly the question that investors and we have an indication that regulators are also looking at. He came out quite strongly saying that funding is secured, and that's an important factual question. What did he mean by that? Was funding secured? And if there's some wiggle room there, what was his intent behind that statement? And I think that the next couple of weeks and months will allow this to play out a little bit.
What are the ramifications if his intent was, I mean, is this an intent story? By the way, that's like a criminal charge, intent. I'm not sure that the SEC looks necessarily at intent. That's not really the goal here, right?
Well, I think the SEC is going to be looking at potentially two things. The first is whether or not the tweet itself complied with Regulation Fair Disclosure, which is a regulation designed to ensure that any information put out to the market is put out broadly and not in an exclusive
So this was put up broad. We got that part.
Right. So now the other question then is, was the statement true or false? And when you're talking about truth or falsity, the SEC does look at intent, not necessarily for criminal charges. That's for the U.S. attorney's offices. But the SEC, in order to bring a fraud charge, does need to determine the speaker's intent.
Michael, we got to go. So 20 seconds. Here's the question. Market manipulation. That's the other thing people talk about. If the intent was to shake out the shorts unto themselves, is that market manipulation, given that his incentive always is to be long?
It'll depend on the facts and circumstances, but as you've described it, it could quite possibly be market manipulation.